I wanted to start today. First of all, the questions that is by far on top of everybody's mind is what is censure? But before I got to censure, I wanted to make sure everybody really understood what impeachment is, because there's still confusion about impeachment, and it actually matters. So impeachment is not a criminal trial, not a criminal trial. Impeachment is a political system that is in our Constitution for us to have a system through which we can remove somebody who is not performing the duties of their office. So, so my great example of this is if, for example, we had a president, I'm going to pick on a president here, who was just sitting at home watching TV or playing video games or something. That's not illegal to do that. But that would mean that person was not performing the duties of their office. So it would be better for the country to get rid of that person. So impeachment is a two-part process, and this is driving me kind of insane because it's getting confused a lot in some media reports. The first part of the process is essentially, and I hate to even say this because some people are going to go, oh, this is what she said it was. It's like a grand jury investigation. It's not one, but it's like one, in that what the House does is it takes a look at the behavior of the person in that office, and it decides whether or not it wants to impeach that person. And literally the word impeach means that you don't believe someone, that you got some doubts over there. So you can impeach someone's veracity, for example. You can impeach their truthfulness. You can say, I don't trust you. So to impeach them says, hey, we've looked at this person's behavior, like Andrew Johnson, for example, after the Civil War, and we think he's not doing his office, he's not doing the job of his office right, and he's causing trouble. Like for Andrew Johnson, saying that a number of the members of Congress ought to be hanged, probably not the right thing for the president to do. So the House votes on that, and then if they pass those articles of impeachment, and there's all kinds of really interesting ways that one writes those articles, whether they're going to be broad or whether they're going to be narrow, and there's different schools of thought about whether they should be broad or narrow, what should be involved. Then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate is supposed to create itself as a jury to listen to the charges. So this is why there were House managers of impeachment, and they were making a case the same way one would do in a court of law. And but it's not a court of law. It's absolutely, so the normal rules of a court of law don't obtain. So for example, the Congress, the senators actually have to swear an oath. They have to be sworn in, but they don't. You don't have to have the normal rules of evidence and the things that you have to have in a courtroom. And crucially, unless the Congress, the Senate wants, Congress, by the way, is both houses together, unless the Senate wants to impose penalties for lying to the Senate, which is, by the way, you're not supposed to do, but it has to impose the rules itself. The Senate then goes ahead and it decides whether or not it's going to convict the president for these high crimes and misdemeanors. And the high crimes and misdemeanors do not, as I say, have to be a crime. So the trick is that the founders believed that the Senate, that people would be independent. They would be protective of their own powers, and they would be they wouldn't divide by party. Remember, the founders didn't believe in parties, so they thought that this would be a fair way to go ahead and remove from office somebody who was misbehaving or not doing what that person should be doing. So they're two separate things. Everyone keeps saying he should have been impeached. He was impeached. The president was impeached twice. He was acquitted both times. So he was impeached, but he was not convicted. And they are very different parts of that process. All right, so that's what impeachment is. All right. Now the next question that everybody asked is, what about censure? Because a lot of people are saying, you should be censured. Fine, but let me tell you what censure is and why I just metaphorically rolled my eyes at that. And that is, censure is a formal statement of disapproval. Full stop. What that means is it's operating on the concept that a sense of shame will will hurt people who have misbehaved in office going forward. So it probably will hurt their chances of reelection. But other than that, it's got no practical effect at all, with one exception. So the one exception is that if you are censured in the Senate, if you're a senator who's censured, you have to give up any chairmanships of committees you've got. But you don't take a loss of pay, you don't get kicked out, none of that happens. You simply are censured. Now there's two levels kind of censure. An actual censure means you have to stand in the well of the Senate when they read the censure to you, and you should feel bad. And then the other form is called a reprimand, and that they can just give you on a sheet of paper. They can just write you a letter saying you're reprimanded. Now, I'm being perhaps unfairly flippant about that, but I'm sitting here thinking, I don't really think, people like Missouri Senator Josh Hawley are going to care a lot about a censure, frankly. And certainly, I don't think it's going to stop Donald Trump one teeny tiny little bit from doing anything that he had planned to do anyway. But more about that in just a minute. So the question that people ask about censure, has that ever been done before? Yeah. Andrew Jackson was censured by, he was a Democrat. He starts a Democratic Party he doesn't really start it himself, but people form around him in the 1820s, and the Whig Party loathes him, which is the Whig Party. The Democratic Party forms, and the Whig Party is existent when the Democratic Party forms, and then the Whig Party falls apart over the next 20 years or so, 30 years or so. And the people who run the Whig Party hate Andrew Jackson for a number of reasons, a number of cool reasons that someday, if I ever do the Democratic Party as a history, I'll tell you about. But they go ahead and they censure him in 1834. And then when the Democrats take control of Congress again, they go ahead and they wipe out the censure. So one president has been censured. A number of other people have been, there's been talk of censuring them. James Buchanan. There was also, people forget this, there was also a lot of talk of impeaching James Buchanan as well. And not for secession, but for the fact he was alleged to be corrupt. And there was, during the Civil War, there was an attempt to censure Abraham Lincoln because he let a couple of Congress critters stay in Congress even after they'd become generals, they had been elected to Congress, and he let them stay as generals, and that went nowhere. And then somebody wanted to censure William Howard Taft as well, and that obviously that went nowhere. So Jackson is the only person who's ever been censured. Now there are a number of senators who have been censured, and that's slightly more interesting. The censures in the Senate, there have been 10 U.S. senators censured in the history of the Senate. The most famous, of course, is Joseph McCarthy, although there was a technicality about his censure that I guess I won't go into because it probably doesn't matter to anybody else, but it generally is, it's not used all that much. And then in the history of the House of Representatives, there have been 23 people who've been censured there as well, mostly in the 19th century. And that's one thing that you can do. The other thing that one could do for a senator or a member of the House of Representatives is to expel them for one thing or another. And that has happened, usually for crimes, or most dramatically for people who adhered to the Confederacy. And there are a number of people who get expelled from Congress for supporting the Confederacy. So that's what's going on with that. Now, somebody asked as well, is there any what's going on? Is there any penalty for state Republican parties censuring the people who voted for either impeachment in the House or for conviction in the Senate? And the answer to that, as near as I can tell, is no. That it doesn't say anything except we're really, really, really mad at you. Now that raises the question. Christy Fields said, why would you censure a member of your own party? And that's a really, really good question. And just to say here, some of the obvious questions that people ask questions, and you might think that they sound really obvious. they're sometimes the best questions, because like, why are you doing this? That's a really, really, really good question. And Christy's question is a very good one. And that is, why would the state Republican parties censure their own members? They got elected after all. Why would you do that? Well, the answer to that is that because he was very concerned about having competitors for the 2020 election, former President Trump worked very hard to pack state Republican parties with his own loyalists. And they are really eager to purge out of the party anybody who is not a Trump supporter. This is part of the major fight going on within the Republican Party right now. So they're actively trying to force people to get on board the Trump train, if you will, or to get out of the party. And the implication there is that if you don't support Trump, they will support a primary challenger to you in 2022. But more about that in just a second. All right, because there's something really interesting, I think, going on right now. You can't forget, even though we're just out of an election, that there's another election right over the horizon, and that I know I don't know about you, but I'm like, oh my God, the last thing I want to think about is another election. But that's what politicians do. They think about the next election, and not just because they want to stay in power, although that's some of it, but because always, always, always they're working on a chessboard, and they're trying to figure out coalitions and how to move things. And by the way, I am not great at this. There are people who understand the chessboards of politics so much better than I do, that it's just a wonder to sit and look at them. And one of the people who is like that is Mitch McConnell. Another one, of course, it was Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi's got something else going on though too, and that's that she can read the political board, but she can also read the country, and that it's just kind of a masterwork to watch her operate because of that. All right, so where are we going? So why would you do that? That's what the states are doing. It doesn't matter. What they're saying is, get on board, or we're not going to support you. We're going to get a challenger into you going forward. But of course, some of the people who voted to convict Trump in the Senate aren't running it anyway, and some have just been reelected, so they've got a 6-year lead time. Like somebody like Susan Collins, who has got 6 years to convince people to forget about that vote if they decide they don't like it, or 6 years to make a lot out of it if they do. All right, so then people are asking, and I probably should say more about the vote to acquit, but I will if I have time, because you didn't actually ask questions about that. So, all right, I won't do that. So people are asking, what about the 14th Amendment and the 14th Amendment to prevent Trump from running again? And when I'm going to talk about that, but I want to point out that Trump is not the only one in danger from the third section of the 14th Amendment, which I'm going to read to you right now. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, immediately after the Civil War, and one of the problems in 68 was that Andrew Johnson, the president who took over when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, went ahead and he pardoned a ton of people who had participated in the planning and the strategy for the Confederacy, former lawmakers and military officials. So the Congress, the Republican Congress, has to do something to figure out, what do you do when all of a sudden all these people are back in the good graces of the president, and yet a year ago or a few years ago they were trying to kill us. So what do? So they wrote this section in the 14th Amendment, and it says this: no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. So you cannot sit in Congress or hold any office under the United States if you have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. It's a really, really potent section of the 14th Amendment. And the question is, can Trump, and I'm going to roll in here the senators and representatives who refused to ratify to count the certified ballots for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris on January 6th, could they be wrapped into this? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And it appears that it would take only a majority vote to do that if, in fact, the Democrats were willing to abandon the filibuster. And it's a really interesting question. Now, the argument against doing that is that it is a way for the government to punish somebody going forward. And the answer, it's called a bill of attainder. And the answer to that, and I think it's a definitive answer, is that the Constitution gives the members of the House and the Senate the right to determine the qualifications for the people who are able to sit in their body. And this says you don't fill these qualifications because you have participated in this. So the other proof of whether or not you could do this is, of course, after the Civil War, a number of people were in fact forbidden from holding offices because of their participation in the Confederacy. But that law was not limited to the Confederacy, if you read this, which I think actually would have been a problem to do. But for reasons having to do with, well, whatever, I think it would have been a problem to do that. But we have used this bill since, and this issue since. In 1919, Congress barred a man who was a socialist from Wisconsin. He had taken an oath as a prior member of Congress, and then he had given speeches in opposition to American entry into World War I. And when he did that, they said because he had taken that oath of office before and he had given speeches that they considered that gave comfort to the enemy, that he could not sit in Congress. And it stuck. His name was Victor Berger. So we have actually used that before, but there's going to have to be political will to make that happen. And I hope to get more about that in a second. All right. People asked about today. So let me do one more about the first about the impeachment. Why did Chief Justice Roberts oversee the first impeachment and not the second? Really simple answer to that. The right-wing media made a lot of it, but it was a no-brainer. The rule in the Senate is that technically the vice president oversees the happenings on the floor of the Senate, presides. That's the word, presides over the floor of the Senate. But the vice president hasn't actually done that for a long time, and the person who does it in this case her, but his stead, is the Senate President pro tem, and the Senate President pro tem presides. And if the President pro tem doesn't want to do it, the President pro tem can hand that off to somebody else. And so there's always a member of the Senate who presides over Senate business. That's just the way it's always done. But they can't do that for an impeachment of the president. That's the one time there's an exception, because the person who would preside would be the vice president, right? And the vice president can't preside over that, because if the president is found guilty, that would put the vice president into the president's chair. And the founders were trying to separate that connection out, because it would give the vice president a reason to go ahead and try and push the Senate to convict. So it's not that this trial was weird. It was that normally I can't believe I'm using the word normal, because presidential impeachments are not normal, but normally in a presidential impeachment, the vice president can't oversee that. So that's when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court steps in, so that they remove that self-interest from the system. So that's why it was Leahy and not Chief Justice Roberts. That was actually sort of a return to normalcy, not a step away from it. All right, I want to go back to that question in just a second. Oh, you people asked about the KKK Act today and what is going on with the I have a question for you here. Somebody just texted me to say, am I here today? Why can't this person find me? I'm on Heather Cox Richardson, right? And not my home page? Well, I guess if I'm not, it's too late now. Um, now I'm flustered here. No, that's Heather Cox Richardson. I don't know why she can't find me. All right. So the next question you people asked about was what is happening today with this new lawsuit from, I believe it's Bernie Thompson from Mississippi against former President Donald Trump, his lawyer Rudy Giuliani, the Oath Keepers, and the Proud Boys. What is going on with the fact that he has sued them under what's known, it was actually technically one of the enforcement acts, but it's known as the KKK Act, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And what is happening with that? And this is fascinating. This is just fascinating. So I can't tell you how this is going to come out, but I can tell you what I think he's doing. So the law itself, what happens is immediately after the Civil War, the KKK organizes, and it organizes initially, apparently, as sort of a club to help the widows of Confederate veterans, very briefly. But quickly, it turns into a political organization that is determined to guarantee that Republicans, especially African-American Republicans who are able to vote in state constitutional conventions after 1867, and the white people willing to work with them can't vote. So what they do is they ride around in sheets that are designed to look like the ghosts of former Confederates. That's why they wear their stupid sheets, is theoretically they're supposed to look like, Confederates come back to haunt people. And it's interesting from a historical perspective, the fact they cover their faces, because when you cover your faces, it's because you're trying to hide who you are. That's because they know that the army is around and the federal government has teeth behind the idea of protecting African-American rights, and certainly behind protecting the rights of white Republican voters in the South. So they dress in these stupid uniforms and they go around and they start to kill people, but not just kill them. I mean, they certainly lynch people after 1867, 1868, really bad years, about 1,000 people killed before the election of 1868 in the South. But they also intimidate them. And it's a really interesting moment in 1869, 1880, when there is a Senate investigation of the violence in the South. And one of the interesting things about it is they interview a number of African Americans. And what they say is really interesting because they talk about how terrified they are. And then the senators say, have you ever seen a lynching? And they're like, no, I haven't seen one, but I know there was one nearby. And that's, of course, how terrorism works. You go ahead and you put the fear into everybody so that it doesn't take nearly as much to continue to keep them down. So this is what happens with the KKK after 67, 68. By 1870 and 1871, they're running rampant in a number of southern states. And there's really no way to get them to stop them because the state courts won't do anything about it. And this is where we get the Department of Justice in 1870 under Ulysses S. Grant and the Republicans in Congress. They go ahead and they establish a federal branch of the justice system to go ahead and make sure that there is going to be justice within the states. So they pass the Department of Justice, and then they actually have to have some teeth in it to go after the KKK members who are running rampant in places like South Carolina and Georgia. And in order to do that, they have to pass a number of what are called the Enforcement Acts. So one of them is the 1871 Enforcement Act. Off the top of my head, I think it's the third one. But what's interesting about that, and the reason that I find it interesting they went after that one, and if you actually read the lawsuit, which you can do online, and I have not studied it, I've only skimmed it because I'm actually trying to write something today, which would be cool. But there's something cool, there's something different about the 71 law, and so if you read the lawsuit, the representative from Mississippi. And the media is making a lot about how this is a Reconstruction thing, and it's about race. And obviously this whole thing is about race and power. It's always about power. But the lawsuit starts with him saying, I am an elected representative, and I was supposed to do my job on January 6th. I showed up to do my job, and these people stopped me from doing it. I couldn't do my job. And he sues not as a member of Congress, as a body of Congress. He's suing as an individual, and he's suing a group of people who conspired together. And this is something that's in the 1871 law, that you can't stop somebody from doing their job, an elected official from doing their job. So he's going in to not as in the at least initially the idea that that Giuliani and Trump went after black voting, although that's certainly the backstory, but he is quite specifically saying, you stopped me from doing my job. All right, so why that piece of the law and why go in that way? And mind you, I am looking at this historically, not legally. So I've probably got legal people here going, wait a second here, you've missed something, and maybe there's a different legal strategy. But I'm looking at this as a historian. And what's interesting about that particular Enforcement Act is that it was amended in 1983. And when it was amended in 1983, it permitted there to be financial settlements for civil lawsuits over this law. So in the past, when there was an investigation of something like some group like the KKK, and they were found guilty, they went to jail or whatever. But the person who was harmed rarely saw much for it. After '83, you could sue for damages. And one of the things that I suspect you're going to see is that Thompson has asked for damages, and there's not an amount specified that I could see. Mind you, I did not read it; I only skimmed it. But the reason this is interesting, and I'm sure the right-wing media is going to say, "Oh, he just wants money. He just wants money." But no, the trick here, to my mind, as a historian, is that when after 1983, people like state-level KKK members could be sued civilly for large sums of money and lose their homes and lose their livelihoods, it broke the back of those state organizations. And similarly, in the past in America, when we have had lynching, say, of the Sicilians in New Orleans during Reconstruction, or of Mexicans from the middle of the 19th century into the 20th century, what really managed to stop those lynchings was that foreign governments stepped in and said, hey, pony up some cash here, dudes. If you're going to be killing our citizens, we expect recompense. And the federal government by the 1920s begins to step in against lynching of, as I say, Italians in the case of the South, or Mexicans in the case of the West. So you put a price tag on it. And my guess is, and I am not a lawyer and I'm not a legal strategist for either the NAACP or Representative Thompson, my guess is he's using this idea of a very specific wrong to get a major financial settlement, not because he's lining his pockets, but because once it costs money to show up and pull the kind of crap they pulled on January 6th, a lot of people are going to stop showing up and pulling that crap, because it always happens. Once there's a price tag involved, people stop doing it. So that's my guess. That is my guess as to what they are trying to do, is to go ahead, have a very specific wrong, and then go ahead and try and get monetary damages. So the next time somebody says, hey, let's go storm the Capitol, someone else says, hey, man, I can't, it'll bring down my business. That's my historical guess on it. All right. All right, next question. So I'm going to jump here to, it's another short one here. I'm going to go here tuck this in the middle here for those of you who have followed this long. By the way, I'm seeing that there are creepy people who are acting like this is a dating site. They're not actually interested in dating anybody. That's a political attack. They don't want people here, and they want to make the people who are here really uncomfortable. So please block them and report them, and whenever I see them, automatic ban, and they pop up seconds later. But what they discovered is that people in this site are now empowered to push back politically, but everybody's creeped out by these "hello, honey, can I get to know you on a private level" thing, and they're trying to make women feel unsafe. So they're probably not real people. They're probably part of a troll farm. Block them, throw them out. All right. Next question. Somebody asked, and I'm going to tell you. What do I think of Mitch McConnell's political strategy? And I don't know the answer. I do not know. Obviously, I have no insight into his brain, but I have some guesses. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you what they are, with the caveat that they are guesses and they are quite possibly wrong. All right? We're in a really funny time right now. And I don't mean generally, and I'm going to speak to generally in just a minute because somebody asked a question about where we are generally and where I stand in that, and I'll try to answer that. But in terms of the Republican Party, which is, of course, my field of study, what's happening with the Republican Party? And everybody would love to have a clean answer. The Republican Party is going to split and it's going to go down in flames. There's going to be a third party or whatever. I can't give you a clear answer because those chess pieces are moving every minute. I will tell you, I look at this moment historically, and I will tell you the party cannot stand the way it is now. There's no way you're putting the Trump people and what I'm calling now the business Republicans back together. And let me be clear once again, when I talk about today's Republican Party, of which I am scathing for the most part, I don't mean the Republican Party is a historical body. And I always try and specify that when I talk about the Republican Party, I'm talking about the lawmakers, the people who are currently in power, because the Republican Party as a whole, historically, was a wildly important party that has done enormous good for this country. And their ideology is one that many of the people here who think that the Republican Party now is garbage would actually vote for. Because what the Republican Party traditionally stood for, and I probably won't have time to go in, maybe I'll go into something else. What the Republican Party originally stood for was, think about Lincoln. The Democratic Party in Lincoln's day, in the 1850s, stood for the idea that there are haves and have-nots, that there are these two groups in society, and what the government's job was theoretically, and again, by the 1850s, the Democratic Party's in its own little weird rabbit hole, but the role of the federal government is to keep the balance level between the two of them. That's what Jackson was about, and I'm not defending Jackson, believe me, but that's the theory behind the Democrats, is that, the world, I always think of it as the world is a line for the Democrats. There's more to it, but the Republicans under Lincoln say, no. Your idea of the haves and the have-nots has mean you've ceased to try and hold those two things level, and instead all the weight is going to the very wealthy people. The way the government really needs to interact with Americans, because they're explicitly talking about Americans, is the government needs to support people at the bottom. It doesn't need to support people at the top the way the Democrats are talking about now. It needs to support people at the bottom, because if you put the resources of the government to the people at the bottom and you guarantee that they're equal before the law and they have equal access to resources, they're hard workers. They're going to produce more than they consume, and they're going to support the next level of merchants and maple syrup makers and shoemakers, and they're in turn going to work hard and produce more than they can use, and they're going to support a very few bankers and a few industrialists who in turn will hire people at the bottom. So the Republicans kind of see the world as a web. And I could walk you through, and it's a circle, I could walk you through how that has played through our history. But if you think about the great reformers, in American history, I know you don't usually think about Grover Cleveland, he's one of them, but when he talks about reclaiming the government for the American people, he really talks about us versus them. Teddy Roosevelt, who takes over after him, says, no, it's not us versus them. You people are nuts. It's about everybody working together. And those two, they're not black and white. They're not yin and yang. They're entirely different ways of looking at the government, and we need them both. So when I pick on the Republicans nowadays, I'm not picking on the Republican Party with its original ideology. That ideology of the Republicans got taken over in the 1980s by what I would call a cabal, a group of people who rejected that idea and said, no, we can't actually use the government to help people at the bottom, because that, they said, would be a redistribution of wealth. It was a form of socialism. We need to get rid of the government doing anything except protecting what they called individual enterprise, but what was really big business, and religion. I mean, they're actually talking about protecting religion as well. And that's like the 10 Commandments. You can't mess with that. We can't argue, we can't compromise, we must be absolutists. And the way that we get rid of a government that goes ahead and regulates big business and protects this basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure. All things that people like Eisenhower and Teddy Roosevelt and even Lincoln, although he wasn't talking at that time about a social safety net, all of those things had always been embraced by Republicans. They say no, by a group of Republicans. They say no, we're going to get rid of this government. We're going to go back to a government that essentially looks just like the Democrats in the 1850s. The government's going to do nothing but protect private property and protect religion. And the way they were going to get there was to slash taxes. And the more they cut taxes, the more the government would have to cut back. The only thing that they kept on spending money in the military, because that, of course, is the other thing the government's supposed to do. But the money that's going into the military was also going into the pockets of the people who had, who were the part of the military industrial complex that people like Eisenhower worried about. So when I talk about the Republicans, I'm talking about that cabal that quite deliberately got rid of the compromisers. They got rid of the people who were willing to go ahead and say, hey, I see the world as a web, but I get that the Democrats have a point. We can meet somewhere here. Maybe it's over here, maybe it's over here, but we can meet. Those people all got bled out of the party. And one of the problems that we've had is the number of people who still remembered that as being the heart of the Republican Party, instead of what are now the Trumpers, the people who are completely unwilling to compromise. But they're not new. I mean, this was really, goes all the way back to Newt Gingrich, who started to call anybody who did believe in compromise a rhino, a Republican in name only, which was a beautiful sleight of hand on his part because, of course, he was the actual rhino. They weren't, he was. So we're in this moment when we don't have in the lawmakers. Now we got a lot of Republicans out there who still think the way that I just described, Eisenhower Republicans, if you will. And that that's not, well, then we have who's left on this side. And they are dividing between what I'm calling now the business Republicans, the Mitch McConnells, and the Trump Republicans, who are adhere only to Donald Trump. And it's really weird because they seem to have no ideology except the idea of this strong man who will hurt their enemies. And there's people have asked about fascism. There are many aspects of fascism that the Trump cult, I would now call it, is using, the images of him always in front of flags and all that kind of stuff. But he's actually not a fascist so much as an oligarch. He wants to create an oligarchy, I think, that looks much like that of Russia or of Saudi Arabia. And fascism is actually technically slightly different because it involves a much broader, if you will, marriage between industry and the governmental structure. And he's actually quite happy to destroy an industry if it gets on the wrong side of him. So that's a bit of a technicality. Anyway, so if that was where we are, what's Mitch McConnell up to? Okay, Mitch McConnell is fascinating because Mitch McConnell is all he cares about is power, as near as I can tell, and that's kind of odd if you think about it. I mean, lots of people care about power. I mean, think about somebody like LBJ or people in your own life, people who really want to be in charge of things. They want power, but that's not all they care about. There's something else leavening that somewhere. I can't see that anything else is leavening that with Mitch McConnell. And if you're interested, Jane Mayer, I'd read the phone book if Jane Mayer wrote it, but she wrote a terrific piece on McConnell last summer in the New Yorker that talks a lot about who he is and what he cares about. So what's his problem? McConnell is furious because, and again, I am speaking as if I know. I don't know. This is my read on it. I have no insight into Mitch McConnell's brain. But what I'm reading is Mitch McConnell is insanely mad at Donald Trump because it's frankly Donald Trump who sank the Republican candidates, or at least it looks like it was Trump who sank the Republican candidates in Georgia in those special runoff elections because he was trying to put enough pressure on Georgia Republicans to go ahead and change the vote in Georgia. So if you remember, he kept saying, don't vote, and, unless they come out, this is corrupt, unless they, don't come out and vote because the apparatus is corrupt and all that. And what that meant was that Mitch McConnell lost control of the Senate. When Mitch McConnell lost control of the Senate, he lost control of the government because as long as Mitch McConnell had the filibuster, he got to dictate everything. mean, literally, he made sure that Barack Obama couldn't put someone on the Supreme Court. Think of all the bills that didn't get passed. Think of all the things that got stopped dead. And this is a moment to recognize the extraordinary importance to our political history of Stacey Abrams. Because Stacey Abrams is not single-handedly, she's very good about saying this was a team effort, but she was instrumental in registering people of color, and not just Black Americans, a lot of Asian Americans in Georgia, to vote and to turn out and to vote for the Reverend Warnock, Raphael Warnock, and John Ossoff to go into the Senate and to give Biden, for at least a short time, a majority in Congress. One of the reasons Biden is moving as quickly as he is. So Mitch McConnell is mad. And he's got this problem because he needs the Trump voters, but he doesn't actually want them to control the party, because here's the split. The business Republicans are the ones who get the money. That's who the big donors turn up for. But they can't provide the votes. It's the Trump people who provide the votes. But the donors don't like the Trump people because they don't want the kind of instability in our government that we've had. And they certainly don't want to put somebody like Trump back in power because, as I say, he's an oligarch. And remember, all he had to do was tweet and he could tank your stock. They don't want that at all. They want there to be a level playing field. So they want the Republicans in power under Mitch McConnell, but they don't want the Trumpers. But they need the Trump voters. So Mitch McConnell is trying to wed those two things, and they're not going to come together. So one of the things that I think is really interesting right now that you asked about, something else here. Where's Pence? Well, right now, it's interesting that Mike Pence has disappeared. First of all, the man deserves a vacation. Let's just put that out there. Second of all, he is likely getting threats against his life. It would not surprise me at all. Certainly, it sure looks to me like if the mob had gotten their hands on him in January, we would have just had, I don't even want to say it, it would have been horrific. Those two things are definitely out there. But look who came out really well for the Republicans out of that impeachment trial. Virtually no one, right? Except the 7 people who switched their votes, especially, by the way, Lisa Murkowski, who I probably won't have time to talk about. Mike Pence came out of that trial looking pretty good, because the impeachment managers kept saying, look at Mike Pence, he did his job. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to split the Republicans away from Trump and say, listen, we're not talking you have to join the Democrats, just back Pence instead. So Pence actually probably is a more viable political candidate than he was before that impeachment trial. So back to Mitch McConnell, what's he doing? He desperately wants to take back the House and the Senate in 22. How are you going to do that? First of all, you got to shut up Donald Trump, because every time he speaks, he upsets people, right? So you got to get him to shut up. How are you going to do that? Well, you're going to threaten him with something. What are you going to threaten him with? And you're probably going to say to him, don't you dare primary anybody. But maybe you say, we won't impeach you if you, I'm sorry, I just did it myself. We won't convict you if you promise not to primary our candidates. Maybe. And maybe they say, we got Mike Pence hanging out here that could take your place. I don't know. It's what is Mitch McConnell doing? I think that that we don't know what Mitch McConnell is doing, but I think that it's, as I just said about that earlier question, it's worth paying attention to the things that seem obvious. Why haven't we heard from Pence? Why haven't we heard from Trump? To my mind, even, why did Kevin McCarthy go down to Mar-a-Lago? Was that a conversation? There's a lot of things that would be worth interest. That as somebody who watches the chess pieces, I'm very interested in. All right, so all of that could be wrong, by the way. You asked. That's my take on his political strategy. All right, so a couple other things. People have asked about criminal prosecution. What's going to happen with criminal prosecution? I am not a lawyer, but I will add that from my observation, I think that yes, that the Trump and the Trump family are going to face criminal prosecution in one place or another, but don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. This stuff takes a long time, and these cases are very complicated. And I will tell you again, without knowing what's in anything to do with the Trump family, I shouldn't say that. I do have some inklings there. If, in fact, Trump ends up on the wrong end of a criminal something, if it were me, I would guess that it's going to be related to finances. And the reason for that is simply because it's much easier to win a case when there's paper involved. When you can say, you said the money was $100 over here, wouldn't be 100, $100 million over here, and over here you said it was $16 million. One of them is a lie. It's much harder it's much easier to do that than it is to say, what was your intent when you said, I will march with you down the Capitol? So I don't know the answer to that. I do think there will be criminal prosecutions. I don't think you should be setting your watch by them yet. Although famous last words, right? I don't know. All right. A couple other things here because we're running low on time. One thing that somebody mentioned that I think I'm not going to really comment on, but I think is really important. And this person said, one thing that disturbs me is how little attention has been paid to misogyny as the leading edge of this violence. More equitable and more severe handling of domestic violence among white folks could probably have put guardrails around a lot of these insurrectionists. And how can we make that happen? And I wanted to call that out because this person who wrote this is dead right. This is dead right. And one of the great things that I talk about a lot, I'm sure you've heard me talk about it a lot, as the great hidden epidemic in this country is domestic abuse and domestic violence. And yes, I mean, one of the things people point to again and again is that people who go on to commit acts of violence are often associated with issues of violence against women. And that's something that absolutely needs to be on our radar screen. And even I forget to talk about it in this context, in the context of violence. But you can certainly find plenty of articles that say, hey, look, the people storming the Capitol building had this history of domestic violence. So that's something absolutely to be paying attention to. All right. A couple of things. Okay. We've got 10 minutes here. Somebody asked, has there ever been a period in American history when conservative ideas and policies have been in place and average Americans have benefited? So I want to say something here about conservatism, because this is a concept that is really not very well suited to America. So the idea of conservatism as something more than sort of a gut sense, as an ideological set of principles, and even then they weren't fully articulated, came from Edmund Burke who's a philosopher during the French Revolution. And he said, he had actually been in favor of the American Revolution, but he looked at the French Revolution. He said, look, you people are all committing these acts of horrific violence because you're enslaved. He didn't use these words, by the way, I'm paraphrasing here, to an idea, to an ideology. And that's not the job of governance, because what that's going to do is sooner or later, you are going to be trying to get the world to conform to your ideology rather than your ideology to conform to the world. Which, by the way, is precisely the reason that I'll tell you that in a second. So that became known as conservatism. And he said, really what the idea of governance is about is stabilizing society. You want to protect the institutions in society that stabilize them. Marriage, the church, property, things that mean that society, you're going to hand on society to the next generation. And you need you need always to pay attention to reality, to the facts on the ground, and you need to conform your governance, your laws to the facts on the ground, and you need to try stuff out, and if it doesn't work, change it. But your goal is to create stability. America really didn't pick that up. It's interesting because the use of the term conservatism in America really takes off in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the people who does that is Abraham Lincoln. He is not using it in the Burkean sense at all. What he says is he starts to use it because people say that because Democrats begin to say that people like Abraham Lincoln who want black rights, or he doesn't actually want black rights, he wants to end human enslavement. He wants African Americans to be on the same legal status as white African American men, to be on the same legal status as white men. He says, Democrats say those people are radicals. And he says, no, I'm not a radical. I'm a conservative because I want to go back to tradition, to the way things were, which is the Declaration of Independence. So the word conservative in America never really picked up the kind of meaning that it had in Britain. So this is where we get people like Dinesh D'Souza talking about how Lincoln called himself a conservative. Well, he did, but he called himself a conservative because he said to be a conservative means that you want the law to treat everybody the same, which is hardly what today's conservatives want. So conservatives today are also using that language, that word conservatism, in an entirely different way. They are not espousing true conservative principles, the idea of protecting the family, protecting religion, and protecting stability. To the contrary, they don't want to use the government that way. They want to use the government in a much more radical way to go ahead and protect, as I say, this ideology that if you in fact turn everything over to the market, everything will work fine. And so they are not really conservatives. They are, to my mind, dangerous radicals. That's what I was going to say before. This is why I call them dangerous radicals and not conservatives. Now, that being said, has there ever been a time when conservatism was good for people? Sure. Lincoln's sense of conservatism gave us the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment and the idea of equality before the law and equal access to resources. Teddy Roosevelt's idea of conservatism was that the government had to be used in such a way that it protected an individual's ability to work hard and rise in society. Dwight Eisenhower's conservatism goes ahead and tries to create a rising standard of living for people across the world. So the problem is we got to decouple that word conservatism, which really has never been an American political party or anything, from the modern day. Because today's conservatives they just talk about not supporting tradition. They just tried to destroy the government. That's like the opposite of conservatism. That's radicalism. So that was a bit of a difficult question. Okay, so one more here. One more, and then I wanted to go to one more piece here. Somebody asked, is it possible for Kamala Harris to be impeached? What's Graham up to? Lindsey Graham, South Carolina senator, up to? Okay, something's up with Graham. I don't know what it is. But Graham has struck me as being unhinged for the last couple of weeks, and Ron Johnson too. And his performances are I don't know if he's not really accustomed to. People have suggested that maybe he's not really accustomed to standing forward on his own because he had Trump in front of him before this, and before that he had McCain. But the attack on Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, the fact that he was saying that she would be impeached after Donald Trump being impeached, that's just an incredible stretch. What he is saying is that after the George Floyd protests in Minnesota, a number of people were arrested for their peaceful protests, and there was a fund put together to raise bail for them. And she went on Twitter and suggested that people should donate to that bail fund in order to get those people out on bail. And a study by the Washington Post said that only about 8% of the people who were arrested during the protests even needed bail. Most of them were simply released. And this is part of the attempt to conflate the summer protests with the storming of the Capitol, and they're just not the same thing. I mean, and I don't have time to explain why they're not the same thing, but we of course have a constitutional right to protest in America. We don't have the constitutional right to create destruction, and the people who did so were arrested. But the right wing has tried to conflate those two things, that the looters and the rioters, many of whom, by the way, were from the right. So, for example, the police officer who was shot that they talk about a lot. He was actually shot by a Boogaloo Boy. He wasn't shot by a BLM protester. Um, uh, so they're conflating those two things and trying to say that the attack on the Capitol was the same as the BLM protests, and they just weren't the same. We have the constitutional right to protest. In fact, I think we have a duty to protest peacefully. But the attack on the Capitol on January 6th was obviously not a peaceful protest. They tried to destroy our government. They're not the same thing. So that's what Lindsey Graham is trying to do there. And again, somebody just made the point here that it doesn't hurt when Lindsey Graham goes after Kamala Harris. He is, of course, deliberately pointing the racist part of the Trump base to an African-American or a Black woman, she, biracial in many ways, a woman who is the second in line for the presidency. And she's also so smart, and she's kind of the person they point to when they're really most unhappy. And one of the Stacey Plackett called out during the impeachment trial how often the right wing currently and the Trumpers throw up images of Black women to stoke fear in their supporters. And she called it out, and I was thrilled to see that, because, if you don't put it on the table and we don't talk about it, it's never going to get better. And it's so blindingly obvious. All right, so that's what's going on with that. Somebody asked, what about the accusations that the Democrats falsified evidence? No, that was not true. There were errors. I caught an error that nobody else has yet, but I'm not going to tell anyone. Spelling error, historical spelling error. People make mistakes. I mean, that's the way things go. And one of the reasons there was a mistake in the Twitter thing, of course, was because Trump's been taken off Twitter. But the Trump's lawyer flat out lied. He just flat out lied. He said things that weren't true. He made accusations that weren't true. And this is, again, one of the attack systems that they've used, is to say, to accuse the Democrats of things they're doing themselves. So let's forget about that. Okay, so somebody asked me this. And I wanted to leave with this today. No, I won't leave with this. I'll answer this and then I'll leave with the next thing. Somebody said that I appear to be taking a Democratic stance right now. I am definitely taking an anti-current day Republican stance. But I want to emphasize that one of the things, and right now I am wildly impressed with the Biden administration, which frankly I did not expect to be. He's doing some really smart things, and I'll tell you in a second what they are. But I really am looking at this historically. It's a mistake to see me as a supporter of one party or the other, with the exception, as I hope I just said, the current day Republican Party I consider a dangerous cabal. The Republican Party historically, and what it has been and what it could be, I think we need. Democrats get angry when people like Nancy Pelosi say we need a strong Republican Party. I'm one of the people who thinks we need a strong Republican Party, simply because you need at least two viable political parties to have a democracy. You have to be able to have a channel for people who don't like the party in power. Because if you don't, what you're going to end up with is people who are either have to be crushed by the state, or who go ahead and commit violence against the state. So I'm a huge believer in having two healthy political parties. And right now the Republican Party is not healthy, and I will do everything I can to return it to a healthy party, which it currently is not. That doesn't mean I'm going to vote for them. It doesn't mean I'm not going to vote for them. It means that because I look at this historically, I would like to see both parties restored to health. And I am not going to say, I'm not going to try and both sides it. When one party's president tries to destroy our government, I'm going to call that out. Somebody else, is it I don't have an objective stance at all. I have my stance when I do this stuff is I am extraordinarily pro-democracy. I am pro-American democracy. That doesn't mean I necessarily adhere to a party or another, but I'm surely not sitting here going, oh, well, we could go fascist or we could go and this will be okay. No, I am always going to take the side that I think stands the most chance of promoting American democracy. And by the way, that does not mean going back in time either. I think we're facing a lot of changes that I, for one, welcome in terms of inclusion of other voices, and not because it's the moral thing to do, although it is, but because I think that that's the way you have a secure democracy. You make sure everyone's got a say, and you make sure you listen to everybody. Because like Lincoln, I think that's the way you make the best decisions. And by the way, that's rooted in the Enlightenment. All right, so Kathy Bruick asked, what are the best things the Biden administration has done or accomplished in the short time in office? Okay, here's what I'm surprised by. The executive orders that go after low-hanging fruit never occurred to me. Truthfully, it never occurred to me. Because executive actions, he doesn't just use orders, he's used a couple of other things as well, but executive actions are usually unpopular. I mean, that's the whole point, right? You do it that way because you can't get it through Congress. And Biden has done the opposite. He's been using executive actions to do things people want and haven't been able to get through Mitch McConnell's Senate. So, this COVID relief thing and the Dreamers and the fact that he, again, called for clawing back the $441 billion a year that people don't pay, that corporations and stuff don't pay in their taxes. That's something Trump promised to do. Back in 2016, he never got around to doing it. The idea that when you give out a federal contract, a much higher percentage of it needs to be made in America to protect our supply lines. That's something every other country does. And this is all really low-hanging fruit. And, I sound gobsmacked because I am. Like, of course. But it never occurred to me that somebody would do that because we're so used to gridlock. And that has astonished me. I also think the recentering in his policies of children is new, very novel. I feel certain, although I only feel certain, I don't have proof that it's certain, that Vice President Harris has had a lot to do with that. The centering of children in his policies is obviously something that has attracted the eyes of Mitt Romney, who is talking about something like that now. He's doing other stuff with it, but that's a whole like, whoa, let's look at things from this direction. So those two things have surprised me a lot. But you know what I like best is his return to our norms. And my favorite thing by far that he has done is, you probably didn't notice this, and I've not had time or place to write about it, but at the end of one of the press conferences, the head of the AP reporter who was there, said to Jen Psaki, who's the White House press secretary, said, "Thank you, Jen." And she said, "Okay," and she walked off. Really small symbolic moment, but what it meant was that in the press room, the press secretary answers to the press. So that's an old tradition where it used to be the senior person in the room, but now it's gone to the AP. I believe it's the AP, where the person actually makes sure all the questions have been asked and then dismisses the press secretary. And the fact that she waited for, and they don't let it go on for a million years. In fact, they want to get out of there too to write stories. So generally there's an idea of 40 minutes to an hour or so. But she waited until he said, "We're good, you can go." And she said, "Okay," and she left. And little things like that, the returning of our government to our people and to the system, I think in many ways that matters as much as the bigger stuff I was talking about, because he is really demonstrating that it is our government. And then let me go ahead and hit this last question. To talk about this, someone said, what can we do to start building up? And this says our political party, but I would switch that to democracy from the ground up, local, county, state, national. Of course, run for office if you're interested, and give to causes. But more than that, and this is my thing, I believe you change society when you change the way people think about things. So take up oxygen. Call people. Say that, as you said here in this note, say that you like what the Democrats are doing. Say that this is what you want. Or say that you don't like what the Democrats are doing and you wish they would do something else. But participate and push back against disinformation. Because what has kept Trump and people like him in power is disinformation, is lies. Nobody wants to be lied to. People want good information. And stop letting the disinformation drive our society. And that will include doing things like putting pressure on your cable company to get rid of Fox News, and putting pressure on people from whom you buy things to say that you're not going to support them if they're going to continue to give to people who supported the insurrection, or whatever your breaking point is. Make sure your voice is heard. And I don't just mean by voting, I mean by taking up oxygen, like pushing back on the trolls who are trying to get people not to take up oxygen by hitting on you in my posts. Even that makes a difference in the whole butterfly flapping its wings thing. And there's a lot of you flapping your wings today. All right, I ran over, and I got nothing else. So I will see those of you who want to do history on Thursday. And I got to tell you, I'm sitting here. I've got a few things to say tonight, but it's been a really quiet day in Washington, and I'm so happy I could I don't know what, because to be sitting here going, oh, I'm facing a blank page. What should I put on it? As opposed to, oh my God, I've got 45 stories. How can I possibly call this down? Is an absolute gift. Anyway, thanks for being here, and I will see you Thursday or next week.